The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on Chaos to Cured podcast are the speaker's own. All discussion is based on our own experiences. We do not and cannot guarantee the accuracy or completeness of any information. Chaos to Cured podcast cannot give medical or health advice. All discussion is based upon our personal experiences and meant for general and educational purposes. This podcast is not a substitute for professional help or for diagnostic purposes for yourself or another. Chaos to Cured podcast always encourages you to consult an appropriate professional. Chaos to Cured podcast is here to explain our perspective of the human experience. We hope it leads to questions, learning, wisdom, and knowledge. Welcome, everyone, to Chaos to Cured. So this podcast is really designed for, reaching out and finding a deeper level of understanding on a lot of different topics. And I'm really, very blessed and lucky to have my co-host here. So Jeffrey Freed. And he is the author of a phenomenal book on ADHD, which is our subject today. And it's a New York Times bestseller. And I would highly advise going and picking up a copy. Its title is Right-Brained Children in a Left-Brained World. So one of our things that we just kind of wanted to jump into was some topics that we both have a lot of experience dealing with, because we both work with, children up through adolescents and even adults if they need the help. So if anyone has questions or anything, we'll make sure we put up information at the end on ways to contact us. So Jeffrey, thank you so much for being here. It's always an honor.
Oh, thank you. You're too kind.
Hardly. Well, and, to the people listening to, one of the things that makes this really fun and special is when I was first diagnosed with ADHD, I was really struggling with a lot of other issues that were not known for years. We'll get into all that stuff later. But one of the people that was suggested that we contact was Jeffrey. And so he's known me for a very long time, and a big reason of why I am the person I am now, and stable and solid. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about is how to thrive with whatever we're dealing with. And ADHD is something that, is not talked about as much. And at least in my opinion, from what I've seen in schools and just even how people approach it, they've kind of stopped thinking it's a serious issue or something really important to look at. It's almost, would you agree? What do you think?
Oh, yeah. There are so many people who are labeled at this point, if they're not neurotypicals, that ADD is just one of the labels. Problem is, ADD does exist. And the way this whole system seems to work is certain eras, spelled ERAS, certain eras have certain diseases du jour. And ADD was all the rage about 20 years ago, and it's fallen out of favor or fashion. And now people are being diagnosed on the spectrum. Now, the spectrum, people on the spectrum were very underdiagnosed. So I guess they're trying to make up for time. And the two conditions are linked. Kind of the way I look at it is people with ADD, let's talk about that first. People with ADD have trouble following sequencing. Their brain moves rapidly. They usually, not always, but usually think in images, and they multitask well, but they have trouble finishing anything. Now, the differentiation is that people with ADHD definitely have, they have it. I mean, and they're mostly been diagnosed mostly boys are diagnosed with it. Girls tend to not be diagnosed with ADD, or if they are, a certain kind of ADD. And that's the inactive kind, the kind that inattentive kind. And that's the one where they daydream, and they don't cause problems in the classroom, just at home. Or at some point, run into some huge problems in school because they can't finish anything and they daydream all the time. I don't even know if that's ADD. I have to think about that one, but I can tell you this: ADHD it's there, and you can tell it when you see it. Especially you and I can, because we work with people with ADD all the time. And it's very interesting because a person who really has ADD, you can tell it. They can't sit still. They're constantly fidgeting. If they have something to say, they can't wait to get it out of their mouths before they lose it. And a lot of times they have exaggerated senses, like acute hearing or a strong sense of touch, smell, texture. Won't eat certain foods,
Oh
and
yeah.
that makes it the world distractible. They can hear the wind blow a long distance away. They can pick up everything, and
It's that's such a perfect example and description. And at the beginning of the show, we'll have a disclaimer, but I'll go over it again. We're here. You never want to diagnose yourself, but of not even a but. You just don't want to do it. Always seek a medical professional if
yep,
you're trying to get a diagnosis. That's the way to do it. They're there to help you, and it can be a frustrating process, and that's a different subject. But it's really important that everybody knows when they're listening to us, we're talking from first of all our own personal experiences. As I deal with ADHD, and then at the same time, from what we see and deal with. So on that note, I kind of want to describe to everybody listening, like what I felt with ADHD. And because you brought up the hypersensitivity, and that's something I absolutely have. But I'd sit in a classroom, there'd be a chalkboard up, and I mentioned this before. Like for me, I like the chalk. The chalk was easier because the sound was consistent. Once they switched to the dry erase boards, you have inconsistent squeaks, and it actually distracted me. So even that. But even if the room was absolutely quiet, that
yep,
actually was difficult because I'd hear, a paper flip or somebody click their pencil. And at the same time, too, I'd be clicking my pencil like crazy and not even notice I'm doing it. So, the amount of information I would take in made it really challenging to see what's on the board. And that led me, like many others, to feel, down or stupid or behind. None of those words are good. They're all negative. And that's how a lot of people feel. And it drags them into even sometimes depression, which is why, it's still something that I think is important to talk about. What are things that even people can do that you've seen work, in when you're dealing with that in school for people and parents that are trying to figure out some solutions?
well, I think the system does a pretty good job with compensating for to teach the person with ADD to compensate. Stuff like they can record lectures, they can text notes instead of trying to write them. Even though writing a lot of times is a good thing,
Yeah.
because it sort of forces you to pay attention. But if you look at the name ADD, attention deficit disorder, okay, 2 out of the 3 words are negative, and it's approached as a disorder, a condition. That's shaming. And it's the kind of thing where people with ADD can be incredibly productive if they're doing something that they're interested in. There's a huge difference. If they're interested in space and you're studying meteorology, man, they can lock onto that to be the star of the class, but they don't seem to have the ability to tolerate boredom. And that's one of the huge hallmarks of ADD. People with ADD literally can't make themselves focus on something that's boring or repetitive. Now, they definitely are born with a fight or flight reflex, and that's what the issue is with hyperactive ADD. You are always on guard, always reacting. Your body probably is producing more cortisone and adrenaline than someone who doesn't have ADD. So you crave excitement because at least you control what's going on, and it's hard to relax. Another huge issue is sleep. It's hard to,
Oh yeah.
it's very, very hard to calm your excitable, rapid fire brain. Kind of rehearse the day over and over again. But again, to address the question that you asked, what are some things you can do? You can record lectures. You can take tests in other parts of the room, or take them in a quiet room and have extended time. Because a lot of times when a person with ADD is taking a test, they are filled with anxiety. Will I run out of time?
Oh
What
yeah.
happens if I don't pass this? They put tremendous pressure on themselves because it's a form of perfectionism, which is an exaggerated sense. And I don't think doctors and most specialists realize. I mean, they know that they have exaggerated senses, not they, but people that they're diagnosing, but they don't give it enough credence. And they also don't give it credence the way that people with ADD learn. Um, they really can't sit still for long periods of time.
Oh
And,
yeah. It's
addressing
torture.
that, yeah, addressing that, a lot of schools now, well, they kind of have to if you're on a 504, which you probably want to be on if you're a parent of a child with ADD, because it forces the school to do these accommodations, and they're all absolutely doable. Allow the child a fidget toy. Um, give them frequent breaks. Give them, if they have some task they need to do that turn something into the office, the ADD kid would be great at that. Don't make them sit and listen to lectures and do boring, repetitive worksheets, because that tends to be something that they are really, really poor at.
Oh,
Another
it's
thing,
frustrating. I
yeah,
mean, that is a perfect description. And it was so challenging because of, again, there's a misperception with most of my teachers felt like I didn't care or I wasn't
yeah,
trying.
big one.
So they didn't notice it. It was not an issue of effort. I was really unable to sit still. It was uncomfortable. And the moment I did, I'd kind of drift off. And then the moment your eyes look away, you're hearing all these different things. You can't pay attention to what the teacher says, what other people are saying, but you hear little bits of it. So I always kind of describe it like a processor. You have all these different, systems running at the same time. It just
Yeah,
switches from one to the next. You never feel the whole thread being completed, which is really frustrating because eventually you get to full circle. So at
yeah,
least for me, I'll sometimes get on a massive tangent, have no idea where I was going, and tie it back in. That
yep.
does not really work in school, especially when the teacher says, "Did you hear what I just said?" And I look up and I'm going, like, what do you say? No idea what you said. I haven't heard the last 5 minutes of the person speaking, and it had nothing to do with my level of respect or effort. And that just makes you feel like a total failure when, the next kid they ask, they say, "Fine, since you don't know, I'll ask you." And then that person just rattles off the answer. And I'm like, what? Like,
What's
how
wrong
did
with
I
me?
miss that?
Yeah,
And it's especially when you're at that age, because I was so young when that was already beginning. And they at least have ways to help now. And for everyone listening, medication is never a bad thing. What you want to do is, of course, seek a medical professional to and be very cautious when you start medications, if you ever go that route, just so you don't hike or boost a different diagnosis that might be hidden or missed. So you want to be cautious, and that's what the medical professionals are there for. But all the stuff we're talking about are things that it's nice for a parent to know. Even for me, if I had, well, I have a niece that has ADHD, and it makes it so much easier to explain things because I understand why she's frustrated. And a lot of times it's just like she's really working hard on that paper, getting lost with her numbers. She switches her numbers often. And that's
Well, yeah.
a totally different thing, you know.
Well,
But
it's not totally different, because, and this is an important thing to say, and I'm loving the opportunity to say it. ADD, dyslexia, um, autism, Asperger's are all linked. They're all part of another spectrum. It's just different symptoms arise with different people. My way of looking at it is different than the traditional way to look at it. I thought this a long, long time ago. I think that the person with ADD has the kind of brain that is hyper responsive, can be very creative, can see things that other people can't, but misses stuff that other people can pick up. And they're usually right hemisphere dominant. There's a big connection between that. It's not that simple, but there is a connection. And then as you start moving on this other spectrum that I'm talking about, more to the right, like more right hemisphere dominant, you start getting the people beginning to have the ability to hyperfocus. They're sort of solving the problem that ADD poses. People with attention deficit disorder can't focus on one thing unless they're fascinated with it. However, if something's really interesting, they can hyperfocus, but not enough most of the time. Well, the person that's on the spectrum a little bit, what they can do is they've solved the dilemma. They can hyperfocus on something. However, there's a cost for that. You miss periphery, and you are to avoid being distracted. The way I look at it, if you're more to the right, on this hemispheric spectrum, what happens is your senses become more and more acute. There's a correlation. And for somebody who's really ADD or Asperger's, high functioning autism, what tends to happen to them is the only way they can survive is by sheer will of shutting down the periphery that the ADD person can't do. So they shut it down, hyper focus, and then people think they're not paying attention too if there's anything peripheral going on.
oh yeah, that's a perfect description. And I want to add, I feel a lot of times what they shut out and what I shut out of the world because I kind of had to. A lot of times that built up, and I would have a reaction that came out more aggressively,
Right.
especially towards like a temperature. I'd have a sun on my one ear, and it would just drive me insane, and I'd honestly lose it. And so a lot of times if you're so focused on trying to push everything away, and do what you're told, focus, sit in your chair, listen, and you're trying to keep track of all of this, and you're overwhelmed, like you had mentioned. It was a perfect example. And I would agree. That hypersensitivity, it's when it goes to that point where you have to shut things down and you have to shut things out, it's hard to deal with. And the same reason I wear the same kind of clothing. I like
Yeah.
comfortable clothing. I actually really like wearing a suit in terms of the look, but
Ooh.
I hate putting a suit on.
Yeah.
Like or like a collared shirt is literally torture for me. It because it
God,
cuts into my neck. I don't like them.
yeah, God help you if you wear a turtleneck. It feels like you're strangling. Um,
No, so that's actually exactly correct. And I mean, all of these things, are they are a constant battle. And as you
yes.
said, it's about survival. So people are doing this day in, day out. And a lot of times, again, instead of the teachers and parents and siblings and people that aren't dealing with that same particular issue. Um, what they don't see is that constant battle, and they point out, listen, you didn't hear me. Listen, you weren't focused. And
Yeah.
it's hard. It tears you down
Yep.
over time. And I think that's one of the things that's most important to address is that we all have so many unique strengths. We all have lots of weaknesses too. And there's nothing, a weakness is never a bad thing. It's just a spot we need more practice at.
No, I don't
And
totally agree with that. I tend to think that the emphasis should be on using your strengths to cover your weaknesses, which I do all the time, and I teach people to do that. It's, for example, if you're listening to auditory information, this is a big good hit. If you're listening to auditory information, you've got to visualize it in order to store it, which means that in contrast with the linear left brain, sequential word-based brain, they can sort of play a conversation back as like it's a recording. However, to the person who processes pictorially, and this is of course a degree, no, almost everybody can process both ways. But if you're pretty more out there on that spectrum I talked about, you need to turn words into pictures in order to store them. And what happens is when you're in a classroom, there's distractions. And every time you're distracted, you'll lose your picture. And then you have to go over it again and cover things like a teacher having an accent or having a boring, monotonous voice will impede the person turning the teacher's words into images. They see the world more like a movie where the person that's left-brained and sequential and schools are made for do it a little. They can process some visually, but their preferred mode is auditory. And they sort of have a brain like a recorder, where a person with ADD, usually, and definitely a person on the spectrum, they process visually. And anything that impedes that, there will be gaps. If there's a windstorm outside or they're nervous about something, and remember, their senses are more heightened, they will not be able to process auditory information. Hardly anybody knows that. And
well,
that's,
it gets frustrating.
well,
That is,
can teach it, Kirk. You can absolutely teach some people how to do it. One of my exercises, I have a lot of them that I sort of just figure out, is to instruct the person that I'm working with who has auditory processing issues. I will give them a story, things that I want them to do. I'll make it colorful. My voice will be, sort of excited, but not overexcited. And I'll tell the person to visualize what it is that I'm saying. If they can do it, at the end of my story, I'll ask them to repeat it back in the order that I gave it. They can all do it. Some are amazing at it. So what's that say? It says that the variable in for the person to process auditorily, they need to visualize it. You can train them to do that. You can do exercises like give them 5 or 6 numbers in sequence, nice and slow, and ask them to give it to you backwards, which means they probably have to visualize the sequence. You give enough feedback like that, you can walk right around the problem. And then you
well,
tell the child soul that, in essence, if they don't visualize it, they're not going to be able to process it and to cover themselves. Record lectures. If you didn't get it, go to the teacher and just say, hey, was unable to visualize what you said. Could you give it to me again, please? Copy of notes is good too.
that's great advice. And one thing that you had told me long ago that really helped me was when I was looking at, like, say, a board or something like that. I could even use colors for different letters, for different words, more important ones. So as I would visualize, it was just one more way to visualize something. And that was always really helpful. And I do agree in a lot of ways, even like even picking your career based on some of your strengths, because
Yep.
someone with more anxiety, phenomenal choice for a pharmacist. They're going to double, triple check every single thing going out. So there's nothing wrong with being, and again, that's why, we're doing this podcast to let everybody know all the strengths that people have and try to explain it from people who've had it and thrive with it. And at the same time, from all the individuals that you've worked with, I know you've worked with thousands. You
Yeah,
know,
about 2000 at this point.
I have not worked with that many. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of students and clients over the years. But the from all you've seen and all the stuff, that's why I'm really honored and so happy to do this with you. I think it's a great place to wrap up for maybe the first show on ADHD. I mean, we can go so into depth on this.
Yep.
And your descriptions were just invaluable. And
Thank you.
again, for everybody listening, I will add in, actually, you know what, just so we have it, what's the best, social media ones that you have for them? And then I'll give them mine as well. If they want
I'm
to
not,
find you on like social media.
yeah, I mean, if you get it on Facebook, I find there's some really good, really occasionally some incredible podcasts, not podcast posts is what I meant to say, of people who have um, autism, ADD, or whatever. And the ones that are coming from people who have it are the ones you want to listen to. Experts know a lot, but they don't tend to see the strengths because they're not dealing with the strengths. When I say experts, um, doctors who specialize in ADD, they may give a little lip service to it, but they're mostly under pressure from the parent, from the school to come up with medical solutions, which can be invaluable, but they're certainly not enough. I like Facebook. Um,
What about
I,
so where can they find you? Just search up, I definitely, again, right-brained children in a left-brained world.
yeah,
Um,
you can find me also on Instagram. That seems to be my favorite one, but
okay.
Facebook's good. I mean, I don't know the others that are that wonderful, and I don't dwell on social media either. Um, However, they can be really great sources, and especially if you're talking to people who have it.
Well, thank you for your time. Is there any particular place that you would want people to go if they wanted to reach out to you and
You
work
can
with you?
get me on Instagram. That's pretty
Okay.
easy.
I'll make sure that's in the links and stuff. And thank you so much for everyone for listening. And, please follow up with questions and comments and stuff. And wherever we post this, I'll put this in a bunch of different places. And, please, of course, make sure none of this is meant as medical information. It's all there for, from our experiences, what we see, what we do, and just to help. Always seek medical attention if you need it. And if you have any questions, seek a medical health specialist. So have a delightful day. Thank you so much, everyone. And we'll get our next episode going. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to Gas to Cured podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with everyone you know. And definitely like, follow, and subscribe. Certainly leave a comment if you'd like. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about the next time. Also, in our show notes, there should be direct links where you can follow us on our social media, as well as reach out to us directly. Thanks again, and have a great day.